well, we are on the second webinar of our advanced course, and thanks to all of you for sticking with us, and we know that you've been working super hard. Emissions inventories are really interesting and hard. So this is a picture of me and Angelique. Angelique, I think that was that toolbox training, which was epic because both of us got like severely impacted by that training. Angelique hit an elk, and I really hurt my shoulders leaning over people's laptops looking at their data. So that was a funny training that will live in infamy, at least for us. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to bring up right now? Okay, great. So we are going to talk about calculations. So this is just a picture showing you the types of sources and potential emissions. So for example, NOx from a gas plant, the emissions are really surprising. How there could be 1,000 tons a year of something that's a gas, which means that when condensed, it's a lot of material. I think we're more comfortable thinking about emissions from cars, and what's really terrible about the whole economy, the way we've set up our economy, which is to run off of fossil fuels, then generating electricity, because electricity is what we really need, is that when we burn these fossil fuels, we can't get them clean enough. So mercury is only one of the heavy metals that's emitted when we burn fossil fuels. And the problem is we can't burn it. You can't burn mercury. So the only way that it comes out is in the air. And that's why we have the extensive mercury deposition monitoring network across the country to look at what happens to this very toxic metal that is emitted with all these kinds of things that we burn. And that's why the catalytic converters, even in our wood stoves, are meant to burn fuels at a higher temperature, because the more cleanly you can burn something, the more actually will go into the energy of the fire or the explosion in the case of internal combustion engines, which are basically like a continuous explosion. I mean, it's really scary, the things that we've just taken for granted in our society. Cars are really scary and inefficient. But I'll get off that soapbox. So how do we estimate these emissions? Well, for large sources that are required to do continuous emissions monitoring, they have units at the top of the stack that measure what's coming out. For example, there's a facility here just south of me on Gila River, and I've watched the guys go up there, and it looks like they're gathering data, and then they climb down again. And that's the best way to estimate the emissions. Of course, they still don't even measure every single puff of air that comes out of the stack, but they're measuring it, and then you wonder, like, well, do they measure it under all conditions or only when they're running their clean fuel? But fortunately, we have laws that tell them, no, you have to measure all the time. And so the best estimates are actually from the stack. Well, that's only for larger sources that are required to do that. So there's these models that can be used for other types of sources, or sources like snowmobiles that we don't have little testers testing their emissions. So there's these different models, and some of you may have heard of. Then I like best, actually, the material balance method, which is that everything that comes in has to go out somewhere. So if you don't include it in your estimates of emissions, then you've done something wrong, because you don't have this stuff in your facility anymore. So that means it either went out in the air or went out in the water. And the simplest way, which is the way most of TEISS works, are just using emission factors. And emission factors are basically a conversion for a particular pollutant. So for example, just for mercury, for a particular type of thing burned, which is a process, how many pounds of mercury are emitted per ton of coal? And these factors are developed from the actual measurements that people have made, as well as all sorts of estimates with different models. So these emission factors are being updated, which is really great because we have people like Angelique, who's best friends with the woman, Sally Dombrowski, at EPA, so that we can keep our emission factors up to date with EPA's. So activity. Activity is like what this guy is doing right now. So activity is what is happening. So if you are burning something, that's the activity. So I like to think of activity as throughput. What material is coming through? What's actually happening here? So hours of operation, tons of coal burn, cords of wood. For cars, for example, you have to be a little bit more complicated because it depends upon the vehicle miles traveled, the types of the road, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So basically, if you've got the emission factor and then you've got the activity, you can easily calculate the emission rate. So the equation, after all this buildup, is really simple. So the trick is in the details, not in this equation. So the emissions rate, and keep in mind this is a rate for what is coming out of this thing, is equal to the emission factor, and TEISS provides the emission factor in the calculators, times the activity or the throughput. So this is what you have to enter. So like I said, the devil is in the details, because this particular emission factor is dependent upon a lot of things that you have to gather information about. So how do we get this necessary data to calculate the emissions? Well, the process, if you're talking about a source, for example, that's large enough to be permitted, then all this information is available on the permit. And this is a picture of a guy searching the internet, because that is what you will have to do to obtain information. A lot of times you just have to become familiar with the words, because of course, like anything, there's different words used in this field than there are in other fields, and the easiest way to understand what you're talking about is to Google it. So you will be spending a lot of time Googling things. It could be possible that the facility that you're interested in will provide you with their monitoring data. I don't see why they wouldn't. Except that they may be defensive about it. You may have never asked before. They may not know that they should give you this information. And then, of course, there's questionnaires and surveys that you can use for example, for a lot of sources, like how many people have pellet stoves versus how many people have wood stoves, for example. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that if you guys have questions, you can type them into the question panel, and Angelique and I will tag team on those. So questionnaires and surveys, we do have some examples of those. Those tend to not be very successful unless you offer somebody something to complete the survey. Like everybody wants even just a free sticker. So a lot of times if you have to gather information, it might be better to do that, for example, at a public meeting where you have a booth and you've got cookies to hand out, and you can find it about, you know, what proportion of people heat with pellet stoves versus the really old-fashioned wood stoves, for example. You might find better information if you try to gather information at a meeting and offer people food. So we're going to talk about what this looks like in TEISS. So I'm going to show you the data collection slide, which explains what it is in real world terms, and then Angelique is going to show you in TEISS. But basically, TEISS has a structure, it's not very intuitive because it's based on the National Emissions Inventory database. And the slides show how the data you collect fits into this structure. Well, I am just going to pull TEISS over right now because I think TEISS is the coolest thing. So I'm just going to show you this, and Angelique will show you in a minute too. So what we're talking about, everything comes from this data input, and then everything we're talking about, and Angelique will show you in more detail, revolves around this panel. So you get to the panel by clicking that input, and then this is called linear data entry. And the idea is that you go top to bottom. So we've got the different kinds of source categories over here, and then for each category, so for example, point, well, in this case, this is a tribe, this is Linda Rosas's tribe in California. It's totally encompassed by Lake County, so that's her location. And then you go down to facility. Whoa, look, she's got a lot of facilities, including animal control. We know what goes into the air from there. And then down to through release points, so this animal control place only has fugitive releases. Then you've got emissions unit, and in this case it's just one emission unit because it's fugitive, and you go down. So that's for point sources, and then at the very bottom, and if you go down enough, you see processes. So this is where we talk about the process. This is the process control approach in case they have controls, all the way down, reporting periods. Now, one thing that's going to frustrate you is that you always have to think about the reporting period because all these are rates. So that's why the reporting period is critical. I see a question. Should we, the question is, do we need a QAPP or specify that you're doing one in your co-op? Unfortunately, probably yes. But if your co-op is already approved by EPA, honestly, I wouldn't mess with it. But that's just my advice, and maybe I'm a bad person. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow, Zoom slideshow, and show you that in that linear data entry screen, basically you have to fill in this information. Now keep in mind, a lot of time the emission, they don't have smokestacks. All the emission is fugitive. You burn this thing and it just comes out all over. So some of this information is not going to apply to most of your sources. So the data collection, again, that is based upon the process that leads you to the SEC selection. So if you, let's look at this process, you can see here's the very, very important source classification code. So all the calculations are based upon this code because this is the process. Because you could have a facility that, and a lot of them do, even every single gas station has at least 4 processes going on. So that process is where something happens with the fuel in this case. Although in this case we're talking about dead animals probably. I probably should have used a different example. That's so sad. But from the source classification code, you can see up here we've got what, Angelique will show you this. I'm sorry, I just think it's so cool. These are called the breadcrumbs that show you, okay, what are we talking about? Oh, right. This is in Lake County. This is animal control. An emission unit is dummy because it's a fugitive. And this is the source classification code. And when you get down to the process, then you see this magic button appear here, estimate, and that pops up the estimators. And those are the calculators. So that's what's cool about the process, is that you get to this estimate button. In larger sources, who knows, if you ask for information and it's probably in the permit, they have flow diagrams. You know, a lot of places don't just consume one thing. They've got fuel, they've got oil, boilers. So everybody has boilers on their land because boilers are used to heat schools, to heat community centers. Sometimes the operating schedule is important, especially for things like schools or facilities that operate just seasonally. And then, of course, control devices. Is there something on here like a catalytic converter that, or filters that reduce the amounts of air pollution being emitted? So in terms of point sources, the TEISS data entry, if you think about what I just showed you with that panel, it goes down in terms of level of specificity. So the biggest general thing is on the top. So this is a sawmill. And then within a sawmill, you have release points. So you're going to maybe have some stacks. You're going to have something out that's the chipper that's out in there in the yard. And you're always going to have fugitive releases. You're going to have emissions units. So in this case, this sawmill has a debarker and a hog cyclone, which sounds like a most excellent chipper, but very scary. And then processes. So what's happening? Well, sometimes it's just the thing that happens in that emission unit. It debarks logs, or the hog cyclone, the process, and see what's here that's critical is the SEC code. So that's what you need to find out which emission factor is appropriate for your hog cyclone versus your debarker. And you could see why this is a complicated job. The period, usually annually, but again, there's lots of seasonal things that happen. And then emissions. Now, if you get the emissions estimates from the permit application, for example, you can enter those into TEISS. You don't have to do these calculations again. But I think it's super interesting to just try it and see if you come up with similar numbers. I haven't heard of any case where there was information that it looked like people just like really lied on their emissions estimates. I've done this, and usually TEISS comes up with larger emissions estimates, so that's kind of a relief. Angelique's going to show you this in TEISS at the end, just because I have a bad cold and I'm feverish, and I probably would mess it up. So I'm going to continue on and talk about non-point source data collection. Now, just because I can't resist, I'm going to show you. So in non-point, how do we get to non-point, right? Okay, so here's the linear data entry. Remember, I get to it from this input icon. This is for point down here. So this panel on the left is like sort of like a navigation tree. It's a little counterintuitive because the selections are at the bottom. But if you click non-point source, then you see this whole hierarchy that we're going to talk about, just the same way that it exists for point sources, except non-point sources are a lot easier. I recommend, if you can, treat something as a non-point source. It's just easier because there's fewer of these data elements. So you can see the non-point location. Well, in a lot of cases, that's just going to be the county. And then you have non-point processes, control approach, all the way down to emissions. And so this is the National Emissions Inventory data for Linda Rosas' tribe. And I apologize, her name of her tribe is so difficult to pronounce. I just prefer using her name because I know how to say that. So the emissions are finally estimated here for this particular process, and you can see the SEC code there. So if you get the actual emissions from a facility, you don't have to do the calculations. You can enter them. So the non-point source data collection is going to probably be where you'll spend a lot of your effort because everybody has lots of non-point sources. So again, remember the process information leads to the SEC code. So for example, everybody's probably going to have gas stations. Oh, excuse me. No, let's talk about cars driving. So if you've got cars driving on a road, their emissions are several things, right? Because there's the road dust that's being kicked up, but then there's also the emissions that are coming out of the tailpipe, and some of the stuff that's being emitted is pretty bad, and especially in terms of the tailpipe, but also some of the emissions that people don't realize from cars are basically tires. When we're driving and we smell, like, you know how you're on the road and you smell other cars, you smell the road, what we're doing is actually sucking in tiny bits of tire, because what happens is a big part of what we have as air pollution coming from cars are all these tires spinning around, getting totally down to their treads, and we breathe that. So you know, when you smell something, that means that there's little molecules of it that are going into your nose. So we're all sucking in tires all the time. That's one of the emissions. So the activity data that you need to calculate emissions includes how you refill your gas tank. So the refilling process, the weight of the vehicle, the average speed, like do people putz along at 15 miles an hour, which of course uses up produces less pollution than if they speed through. That produces a lot more pollution. What about the silt content of the road? You know, obviously you know that if it's like rock, it's not going to kick up as much dust as it is if it's in Alabama on a mud flat where it's dry. And then, are there any pollution management practices? So sometimes people spray all sorts of stuff on roads. There's been a lot of really bad things sprayed on roads with the ostensible reason of reducing the dust, but I know for a fact that there have been radioactive materials sprayed on roads supposedly to reduce the dust, but honestly, really, it was just to get rid of the radioactive material. That's probably happened many times. Isn't that lovely? So, non-point source TEISS data entry. So remember I said it's a little bit simpler than per point. So the location, well, now finally we're looking at on-reservation sources. So your non-point sources, their area is going to be your reservation. Now, if you're using county-level data from NEI, then, of course, that area that the county uploaded to NEI is the county. So remember, the process always leads to the selection of the source classification code, which leads you to the right calculator. So you have to research these SEC codes. These will become your best friends. If there's any control equipment, annually is usually the period, and then again the emissions. If you get estimates of emissions, you can enter them into TEISS, or you can use the calculators. Mobile source. So this is things that move around. So there's two kinds of things that move around. There are things that move around on roads, and there's things that move around off-road. And the on-road emissions include, in order to calculate the emissions, you obviously, who's ever doing that calculation needs to know a lot of stuff, like the road type, the vehicle types and use, vehicle miles traveled. A lot of things go into estimating the huge emissions that come from all of our roads. Off-roads are simpler, but I think, like, based on unit in general, produce more pollution, which is amply demonstrated by this smokestack looking thing that's coming off of this tractor, because the emission controls and the requirements aren't as strict for off-road. You know, I guess the laws are such that if you're moving, you know, you're dragging logs around your own land, why should you have to use you know, emission controls on your tractor? So the off-road, like per vehicle, I think they emit actually a lot more than cars on roads. And they depend on the engine type, the horsepower, the hours of use. So this is something where seasonality would be important. And there are different models used to estimate these emissions. And you need to know, the critical thing here is, in most cases, we're going to be taking somebody else's data. We're going to be looking at what somebody else has calculated and extending it to your reservation and saying that the factors that are important are similar enough that we're going to take your estimates and just scale them down, meaning like if you have 10% of the land from the county on your reservation, you may decide to take, and this is oversimplifying it, you may decide to take 10% of the emissions. So it's important to know when you take those emissions and you assume they're applicable, you know what model was used to estimate those emissions. And you're in luck because you'll be working with us and we can help you find that. So for TEISS data entry now for mobile sources. So mobile sources, we don't really know where they are all the time, right? So it's going to be, location is going to be your reservation for your on-reservation mobile sources. Again, it's going to be the county if you import the data from NEI for mobile sources. The process, the period, and the emissions, these are all things that you either need to figure out or enter the data from and then know what model was used. Okay, fire. Fire is pretty interesting, and it actually, you know, people who don't work in Indian country or don't work in the West or don't ever watch the news, I guess, might not think that air pollution emissions from fires are that important. Of course, we all know that the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago happened because the whole world caught on fire from a giant asteroid. But we're not in, unfortunately, that's not occurring. Let's hope that doesn't occur anytime soon. We do have a lot of fires, though. So fires are a special case in that they cover a large area, but their location has to be defined like a point source, which sort of makes sense. The dates of the fire obviously are critical for fire. Longitude coordinates, whether the fire was man-made or natural, although I'm really not sure why that's so important in terms of the emissions. Like, what difference does it make whether a camper started it? I don't know. But maybe as we get into it, we will find some cases where that's important. And then, of course, the numbers of acres burned. And acres, what a funny unit. This is another reason why it's great TEISS has that unit converter. So the new EPA format and TEISS now, yay, treat fires as events, which makes sense because they usually don't go on for like all winter, let's hope. So data entry for fires is first the event identification. So a lot of fires around here get named by sort of where they started. So I guess maybe the National Weather Service or the National Park Service, I don't know who gets to name them. Maybe it's the boots on the ground people who get there first. The dates the fire started and ended, the location. So if this is a fire that happens on your reservation is the location. Once again, like everything, if you're importing county level data from NEI, it's the county. So where the fire is, the process. I guess if it's a prescribed burn, maybe they're more careful. I don't know how they could be careful with the emissions, but I guess that depends upon perhaps the people who are setting the fire. So the process is important, and then the emissions, which you can often get from EPA. So this is just a slide that shows, I think this is a section from Chris Ray's QAPP, showing what category of emission we're talking about, and then the estimation method and the data needed. So when you find the AP42 section that pertains to your source, which I know you guys all know this, but when you are interested in finding out information, it's useful to go to these emission calculator, just treat this as a source of information. When you go to tools and emission calculators, treat this as a source of information that you have to go to all the time for all your sources, because let's look down on some of these fires. Agricultural tilling, let's just look at. Everybody's got some sort of agricultural tilling. Well, this gives you some information about AP42, and then there's this important link here that takes you to read about this particular estimation method. So that information, like what are we talking about in AP42, use TEISS as a resource to get you to that point. Then paved road dust, here's another AP42 section, and it tells you what you need. Everybody, well, everybody that I've ever dealt with has had residential wood-burning stoves. So, you know, do you use a pellet stove? Do you have a catalytic kind that burns it at a higher temperature so the emissions are less? This information you need to know if you're going to do the calculation following this particular section of AP42. And that is the end of this show. And now I'm going to turn it over to Angelique.
Melinda, we have some questions to cover here too.
Great. How exciting. All right. Ernie says the calculators have seasonal calculators too. That's true. We don't say, you can put in, like even if you only have 1 month, like for when you smoke all the fish you caught, for example, I would imagine that could happen in a short time period. Maybe just January is the month. Thank you, Ernie. Marlene asks, is it from land mass of the county? Yes, you are such a smarty, or other really cool things, Marlene. I don't know if we have time to tell you. I can't stop myself. So what Marlene's talking about here is to say, okay, so how do you scale down? So do I say, like, if my reservation is 10% of this county and 30% of that county, then do I just take those percentages of all their emissions? Well, the answer is sort of yes, but it depends upon what it is. So you could use, instead of just land area, you could use a surrogate. And I'm just so happy to work with somebody as smart and, may I actually say, slightly devious as Angelique, because there are surrogate proportions that you could use too. Like, for example, tribes who have a lot of boats. Well, everybody knows motorboats emit stinky stuff. Well, so in that case, the land mass wouldn't, like the land area, wouldn't be the best surrogate, like to find the proportion, but perhaps shoreline would be. So you can estimate your shoreline and say, okay, the county estimates this much emissions from all the boats, and we have like 80% of the shoreline, so we're just going to take 80% of those emissions. So it depends on what it is, what you use as your surrogate proportion. And then Marlene asked what a prescribed burn is, and that is when, and I guess maybe it isn't true around you, but in the West, the Forest Service for decades and decades just suppressed fires, and then now we end up with this like Holocaust tornado fires that burn so fast and are super dangerous. So they do prescribe burns of certain areas so that won't happen, basically. Okay, so I'm going to make Angelique the presenter. Thank you guys for asking questions. Okay. Now it's time to sit back, relax, and you're on a wonderful journey through TEISS.
All right, so what we're looking at right now is the map of Arizona, and I have imported the NEI data for point sources and non-point sources. And those are the two sources that we're going to look at in more detail today. only because they're the two most common sources, and point sources have, as Melinda showed, an entirely different data structure than non-point sources in TEISS. Non-point sources, non-road sources, and on-road sources have a very similar data structure, and so we're just going to look at non-point to kind of cover all our bases. With events, the structure is unique to events. It's completely different than anything you've ever seen. But mostly for events, you're going to want to get that, events meaning fires, you're going to want to get that data from EPA, because what EPA has done is they've gone through and calculated the emissions for you for a tribe specifically. And I know where to get that data, so if you're interested in including that data in your emissions inventory, we can work with getting that data. So I'm not going to go through how they're set up in TEISS, since you probably aren't going to be entering that data. So we are going to start with point sources. So remember, to access linear data entry, we go to Input, and we click on it. And by default, when linear data entry opens, it opens as with point sources shown. So that's going to be what you see every time you click on that button. It's going to be, by default, opened up into point sources. As Melinda pointed out, if you want to go to non-point, non-road, on-road, etc., you can use these down here. But for now, we're going to start with point sources. And it goes to the top of the hierarchy, so it goes to point locations first. So point locations, that's either the county, if it's NEI data, or if it's your own data, it'd be your tribe. So if you were entering data for your tribe, you would have another location here, which would be your tribe. I just imported the county level data for this particular example. So now what I want to do is look at the details on a facility that's in my area. So I need to choose my area. So I need to go to the right side of the screen and select the county. So in my particular example, that's Coconino County. So I click on it to select it. Now I go back to the left side of the screen and I click on Facilities. And when I click on Facilities, that shows me all of the facilities that are in the NEI data for Coconino County. So if by default, usually on my screen, it scrolls to the bottom. I think that's probably the case for most people. So if you want to see the top, you have to scroll up. So we have a total of 24 facilities in Coconino County that have reported data in the 2014 NEI. So I want to look at one particular facility. I want to look at the EPNG Williams Compressor Station. And I just want to kind of show you the structure of how that's set up in TEISS. So I click on EPNG Williams Compressor Station to select it. And then I want to look at what is associated with that facility. Remember, the Edit button here is also a View button. As long as you don't make any changes to the data, you can use it as a View button. So I want to take a look at this. So I click Edit or View. And this shows me the facility information about that particular facility. So it shows me the address. If I scroll down, let's see what else. We've got the NAICS code, the facility coordinates, etc. One thing you'll notice here is that there's different colors. So there's the white fields and there's the green fields. The green fields are mandatory fields for NEI submittals. They're also mandatory fields when you enter the data into TEISS. So when you're entering a facility, you have to enter the data in the green fields. We totally recommend that you enter as much data as you can into the white fields as well, because it's helpful. Because from right here I can see, okay, this is a pipeline compressor station. I don't have to scroll down all the way to the next description to see exactly what that facility is. So it's always helpful to enter as much data as you can. Since I don't want to modify anything about this facility, this is an NEI data facility that the county submitted. I don't want to mess up the data in any ways. I'm going to click on this X button to close it, and that makes so, like say you accidentally type something in and you didn't want to save it. Once you click on the X button, nothing is saved. So that's how you don't modify anything about the existing NEI data. When you're entering your own data and you make changes to it, you want to click because that's going to save your changes. So that's the two differences between those buttons. The cancel button is the same as the X button. I just like to use the X button instead of cancel, but you could also use the cancel button. So I'm going to click X to close out without making any changes to the data. So now we're going to work down the hierarchy. So I'm going to look at what emission units are associated with this EPNG Williams compressor station. So I click on emission units, and we'll see, okay, we've got 9 emission units that are associated with this facility. And notice here, this is what we call the breadcrumbs panel. So this is starting to build. This is the hierarchy is starting to build. So we know we're looking at a facility that's located in Coconino County, and we're looking at the units for that facility. So I'm going to look at unit identifier 001, and that doesn't, like I said before, the unit description was not filled in, so we don't know what this unit is because that was a optional field and it wasn't filled in. So we don't really know much about what this unit actually is until we click on the edit button. Remember that units are like physical objects that are associated with the facility. So like a boiler would be a unit, a turbine would be a unit. So let's take a look at what this unit is by clicking on the edit button. So we can't tell much. Unit type code is unclassified. So wow, that doesn't tell us much about what is going on at this unit. So that did not help us much. So we're going to drill down and we're going to take a look at the process information, and that's going to tell us more about what's making the emissions at this particular unit. So I'm going to scroll down to processes and click on that. And the process is like the event that's causing the emissions. So there could be multiple processes at a unit. So for example, a good example of this is a gas station. The storage tank is the unit, so that's the physical object. But there could be multiple events that occur at that storage tank that cause the emissions. So for example, the storage tank breathes, so it has emissions from breathing, and then also emissions that come off when the storage tank is filled. So that would be 2 separate processes that's associated with that particular unit. So let's take a look at what processes are associated with this unit. And again, the optional field of process description was not filled in. So we have to select this and go into edit to see what we have here. So notice the process identifier is mandatory and the SEC is mandatory. And the SEC is what's going to tell us what's going on. So we've got industrial natural gas combustion, and that's what's causing these emissions. If we scroll down, I think that's all that's required is those 2 things for emissions process. So that gives us an idea of what's occurring at this particular unit at this facility. So if we look, now we've got this breadcrumb panel building. Remember, when I said this process is associated with this unit, that's only one of the processes at this particular facility, because remember, how many units were there? A total of 8, wait, I think there's 9. So there was a total of 9 units. So each of those units is going to have a different process associated with it. So going with that flow, let's say I wanted to see what is the process associated with Unit 8. There's 2 ways, multiple ways actually, that I could do that. I could go back to emission units up here and select 8 there, or I could have changed it here and done the same thing. So you can either use the panel on the left, or you can use the breadcrumbs panel to look at what is associated with the different units. I'm going to use the breadcrumbs panel. Let's see. we'll look at 8. And again, this particular unit only has one process associated with it. And if I wanted to change that to 9, I could also use this button here, which goes to the next unit. So this one would take me to 9. So that another one that only has one particular process associated with it. So now, let's say I wanted to look at the emissions that are associated with this unit. So if I scroll down to the very bottom, there's the actual emissions. And if I click on that, I can see the actual emissions that are associated with that unit. So that particular unit and that process, and let's remember, how many processes were there? There's only one. There is 0.56 tons of VOC emitted by that process at that unit. Remember, it's not 0.56 tons for the total facility. It's only for that particular process in that unit. That's why using the TEISS reports is often the best way to look at total facility emissions, because it does the work of summing all those together for the units for you. But if you wanted to see the emissions for a particular unit, you could easily do it from linear data entry. Like, for example, say that you had something you wanted to correct, like this was your own data and you wanted to correct it. This is where you would go to correct that data. So let's just see if there's, let's just go back to Unit 8 and take a look at what emissions are there. So in this one, we have a whole bunch more emissions. So we have a total of 11 emissions. And we could just keep going, scrolling through and looking at the different emissions that way if we wanted to. And I think that's all I want to tell you about point sources. Melinda, is there any questions on that?
Nope.
Okay. I'm just looking through my notes and making sure I covered everything. Okay.
You know, let me just interrupt for a second. I'm so sorry, guys. I should have told you. I set up handouts for you. If you want to follow along with the demonstration, and this is also on the course delivery website, and I'll do this in all of our webinars from now on, but what Angelique is showing in terms of the demonstration in TEISS is written out word for you in the notes document, which is a PDF in the handouts panel. Sorry, Angelique, go ahead.
Alrighty, thanks, Melinda. So we'll move on and look at non-point sources next. So remember, to get to non-point sources, use the left panel there, and we select non-point sources. As Melinda mentioned, the structure for non-point sources is much simpler. So instead of this scroll bar that you have to scroll through to get to all of the different data elements, there's only these. That's it. It's a much simpler structure in terms of non-point, non-road, and on-roads. So again, non-point locations, it shows the county, or if you're a tribe that's you've entered emissions for, then it's going to show your tribe there. So I'm going to go look at Coconino County again, and let's look at the processes associated with that county. So processes, in this case, is pretty much sources. So what kind of sources are in Coconino County? Unpaved roads, probably residential wood stoves, probably lots of different processes. So let's take a look at that. And here it shows all of the different processes. If you scroll down, let's take a look at how many there are. Quite a bit. 168. This is one of those situations where I would really highly recommend filling out the process description field, even though it's optional, because when you start building your emissions data and you have a whole bunch of these and you only have source classification codes listed and you quickly want to know what emissions are coming from unpaved roads, unless you have those source classification codes memorized, you cannot tell from this screen what is the unpaved road source. So you would have to go through each of these, click edit, look at the SCC, then determine, oh, that's an industrial coal. I don't want that one. So you have to go through each of those. That's why I highly recommend filling out the process description field. If you don't fill out anything else, optional, fill in that field. Because what is 2102004000? I don't know. So let's take a look at it, what that is, by clicking on edit. Okay, so now we can see, here's the process description field, very important to fill out. But now we can see the description of that SCC. So this is distillate oil, industrial combustion. That's what this particular source is. And again, I think that's the only thing that is required to fill out, but there is lots of other stuff to fill in, and you're highly encouraged to fill in as much as you can. So that is that. And now we're going to look at, oh, here's something I should mention. So non-point processes, Melinda also mentioned this, has the estimate button. And this is where you want to launch the calculators to estimate your emissions for your data. So it's very important that you click on the estimate button from here. Do not, whatever you do, don't estimate your emissions by going to this calculate button, because once you go there and click the estimate button, those emissions are not imported into your TEISS project. They're just showing you the emissions for that source. If you use the estimate button here, they're actually imported into your TEISS project, so you don't have to go through and copy each one and enter it into your emissions. It just copies them for you. So please don't only use this button to investigate what kind of calculators there are. You can look at the links and investigate that way, but this is just for investigation purposes. When you're actually calculating your emissions, use the estimate button here. There's also an estimate button on the non-point periods. It's much easier to do it from the processes button, and we're going to go over that in more details in an upcoming module, but it's much easier just to do it from here. Okay, so having said that, let me see. There's the non-point period that's associated with this industrial, what would say, industrial distillate oil. And if we look at edit button, this stuff will all get filled in for you when you use the estimate button from the process tab. So the throughput and the units and the calculation material type codes, even the reporting period type code gets filled in for you when you use the button from the process option. So let's just take a look at what kind of emissions are associated with this. So for this particular source, the industrial distillate oil, these are the emissions for that particular source. And I think that's what I wanted to show you for non-point. And yeah, again, here's the breadcrumb panel that's starting to build. So okay, we're looking at Coconino County, we're looking at industrial distillate oil, and we're looking at the annual reporting period. And that's, if you wanted to change this, you could use these buttons here, you can use these buttons here, and that changes what you're looking at. Like you can go down, look at surface coating, miscellaneous petroleum product storage, probably it's gas station, open burning, agricultural production. Those are all of the things that are reported for Coconino County. And that's it for non-point sources. So again, the structure is much easier than point sources. It's just much less data entry that you would have to do for non-point sources. Any questions on either point sources or non-point sources and the structure of those data in TEISS?
Nope, they're all excited to get going doing it.
All right, then I guess we should talk about the homework exercise. And the homework exercise for this week is to make a list of what sources you're going to include in your emissions inventory. And this is your level 2 or your level 3 emissions inventory. So we're talking about what sources are you going to measure on the reservation for, and write out what data you need to collect for those sources. And you could do that by looking at the TEISS calculators to determine what in particular you have to enter into the calculator. So in this case, we can use the calculator from up here. So let's take a look. So let's say I am going to do unpaved roads. So I know just by working with TEISS a lot where that calculator is. It's in fugitive dust sources, unpaved roads. And if I click on this estimator button, these are the things I need to collect for unpaved roads. So you would write down, okay, I'm going to estimate emissions for unpaved roads. I need to go out and collect data on the silt content. I could use this unknown button, and then I can use my state or this industrial road type too. So I don't particularly need to collect on the silt content, but if I wanted to, I could. I could do internet search on silt content. So I would write that down. Surface moisture, I can use unknown. Average vehicle weight, I can use unknown. But what I really need is the annual vehicles miles traveled. So I need to collect data on annual vehicle miles traveled. And that's what we want for your homework exercise. Any questions on the homework or anything I have covered or Melinda has covered?
Francine asked just to verify that our assignment is to select the non-point and point sources on our reservation or service area, your emissions area, that you collect. You're not to list them at the county level. Yes, right. That's correct. Marlene asks, so if you have the data for the amount used, the activity, you would click Edit in Linear Data Entry, then input the number in that. Yes, that is what you're going to start doing these calculations. That's how they're done.
But before you would do that, let me just jump in there. So before you would click Edit in Linear Data Entry, what you would want to do, and we go over this in a future module in much more detail, but you'd want to start a new inventory year because we're in 2014. And we want to, when we're collecting our own data, we're probably going to be collecting data on the most recent complete year. So that's probably going to be 2016 for most people. So you'd want to change the inventory year, and we go over that in more detail later. And then you would want to add a new point location, and that would be for your reservation. So you click this Add button, and then you go down to your states. Let's see if I can find New York, and then you would select your tribe, St. Range Mohawk, and then click OK. And then I'm in point sources, but if you were in non-point sources, you would select the SEC. So you would click Add instead of Edit because you're adding a new source. Because you don't want to add to the county data because we're now talking tribal data. So you want to add a new location and you just want to start building from there. But don't worry about entering the sources into TEISS just yet because the module that we're going to come up on in a couple modules, I forget which number it is, but we're going to go over that in much more detail, and actually that will be a homework exercise for that particular module. So for now, just work on listing out what sources you want to include and what data you need to collect.
Marlene has a question about what year to do the reservation area emissions inventory for.
Most likely it's going to be like the most current year that you can collect complete data for. So most likely it's going to be 2016. You can't use 2017 yet because 2017 is not done. So say, for example, you were going out and collecting data on how many gallons of gasoline were sold at gas stations. Well, 2017 is not complete yet, so we can't know how much was sold for the entire year of 2017. And remember that emissions inventories are usually on an annual basis. So what you would want to do is collect data on 2016 because that's the most complete year that you can get data for.
And then Marlene asks, when do I want the new QAP? I guess she's not a bad person like I am. Anytime, Marlene. I won't tell you it's my favorite thing in the world to read QAPs, but I know it has to be done. Oh, and also, if people get comments back from EPA on their QAPs, if they could let me know, and then I could just make sure, and sometimes it's particular by region, like some regions want this and other regions want that. If you could just let me know, that I could help other tribes and just already answer that question in their QAPs. So thank you for that. And you could go count houses for 2017. That's true. So like Marlene's, I imagine she's saying, so if you say okay, let's look at all the smoke coming out of the smokestacks right now. Yes, but the estimations would be for 2016 because there might be factors that are particular to 2016 also, like if it was a really cold winter or something like that. So yes, obviously driving around looking at stuff is going to happen now, but the calculations will pertain for the whole year of 2016. Okay, well, I think that does it for today, folks. Tanda is going to stay on the line because Lakes Environmental is going to assist her with some terrible installation issues. So I'm just going to leave this meeting open, and then Tanda will reconvene in half an hour. I'm just going to leave this one open so that we don't have to fool around. So thank you guys very much, and we're here. We look forward to getting your emails and phone calls.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. So Tanda, I'm just going to leave this open and send an invite to Lakes Environmental for 10:30 because that's as soon as they could do it. Okay, I see you're muted, so you can't talk to me. Okay, I can't. Sorry, I muted you.
That's okay.
Okay, so I am going to go blow my nose, and I'll talk to you in half an hour.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.